This is the Conversation series, and Ben Brown is here speaking at the Top Farmer Conference. I have invited, because Todd's on a boat somewhere, Avery Pound and Jonah Armstrong, who are master's students in Ag Econ at Purdue, to be a part of this conversation because they're really good question askers. So, Ben, you were just mentioning like your background, and I think that might be kind of a cool place to start. So can you repeat some of what you just said?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up on a family farm in west central Missouri, about an hour and a half south of Kansas City. We had row crops and cattle. Went through 4-H and FFA, undergraduate education in agriculture, economics, and agronomy at K-State. Grad school at the University of Missouri, worked for a period of time at Ohio State University. They always said they could tell I wasn't from Ohio because I never said
How long was that? How long was the
Ohio 4 years.
4 years? Okay.
Almost 4 years, which is crazy. But yeah, I was there and then had the opportunity to go back to Missouri, my home state, serve as our state extension specialist for row crop economics at Missouri and work with FAPRI on row crop policy and kind of forecasting work.
So you just gave a really compelling outlook talk related to crops. And I think Jonah might have the first sort of like burning question as our resident Southern member.
You can ask me about cotton.
My farm at home, we grew cotton in the mid 90s, and then it was such a pain and it made everybody hate each other. So we stopped growing it in the early 2000s.
Okay, wait a second. For those of us who aren't familiar with growing cotton,
yes.
Can you tell us why? Is this like our loading pigs? Is this the Midwestern loading pigs?
I have not loaded that many pigs, so
like it's basically the opportunity to hate your family members.
Pretty much, yeah. Well, it's because you have to spray it. You had to spray it
14 times a year.
14 times a year. Like
that's not an exaggeration.
No,
14.
Yeah, legitimately.
Oh, okay.
Like you had to spray it like at least once a week, if not twice, every week over the summer. So it was just a lot of work to get over all the acres. And people want to go to the beach, which is what you do where I'm from, by the coast. Everybody wants to go to the beach over the summer, and it was just not a good time. But we started growing it again when the prices went way up
3 years ago.
3 years ago. We grew it 2 years. And then last year we were going through some of the budgeting stuff, and the best budget that any of us, me or my dad and some of the local input provider people, the best budget we could come up with was like losing $250 an acre on it. So we're just like, said, hey, we're good. We don't need to grow cotton. Is it ever coming back? Are people only buying polyester t-shirts? Like what do you think is the outlook there?
Yeah. So I should preface my answer here with I'm a Midwest wheat guy. So I grew up in the western part of Missouri where we have corn, soybeans, and wheat. Used to have grain sorghum. So I would actually associate to the conversation about loading pigs. Cotton kind of reminds you a little bit of grain sorghum. So the question around cotton is a very interesting one because the demand for cotton is both the conversation around oil. If oil prices get real cheap, polyester becomes cheap, and that competes against, natural fibers, wool, cotton, what have you, right? So there's this conversation around cheap oil prices, which is what we've got, relatively cheap oil prices right now, both in the U.S. and the global market. That increases the competition for polyester. The second part here is global economic activity, and we've seen global economic activity really slow down. Here in the United States, it's been a little bit more stable, but the global GDP has really slowed. Both of those factors, high competition from synthetic products and less buying power by international buyers, has really kind of been a dog for cotton. So that's what's caused this. Now the question becomes, where do we go from here, right? Yeah. And I think in the short run, the way we get out of this is acreage abandonment. Right now, the most profitable outcome for a lot of cotton producers is not to harvest cotton, is to plant it, to let it grow, and then just not harvest it, right? And this is a little different from us in the Midwest where we have corn and soybean production. Our harvest costs are relatively small compared to cotton. Yeah. And so the price really has to drop, or you have to have a really, really low yield not to harvest corn and soybeans, like very low yield. That's not necessarily true in cotton where you have relatively large harvest costs. Yeah. And so if you're getting to the end of the season and you've got a decent crop, you're kind of hoping for a hailstorm, right? You're hoping that a hailstorm comes and wipes out that cotton crop because of the large harvest cost. And so I think our acreage abandonment is what gets us out of this in the short run. We reduced acreage this last year for cotton substantially. I think we need to keep it there for a short run period of time. In the long run aspect, when it comes to cotton, we're going to have to see some consumer dynamic changes around natural fibers and an attitude shift away from synthetics, workout clothes to more natural fibers. And I think there is a consumer argument to be made there. The cotton and the natural fiber industries are trying very hard to make that argument, and I think they're making some headways, but we have more work to go.
What I heard is that Lululemon is killing the cotton farmers.
I'm not going to signal out Lululemon because who knows, maybe they have my home address. I don't know. But I would just simply say that, yes, that representative brand, right? Like people have just gotten to where they like workout clothes that are made from synthetic fibers because they're, easier to breathe. And we see more blends, to your comment, than what we've historically seen. And, not to signal out any celebrities, but sometimes the cotton industry hires celebrities to promote their product, and they do for the photo shoot, and then the very next week you see them out in public wearing synthetic products, right?
Yeah.
And so that's been a challenge.
I did not know the degree to which harvest costs were so much higher for cotton. That's fascinating.
What would you think an acre? What is your...
I'd have to go back and look, but I think a realistic estimate is probably 3 times more than corn and soybeans.
Wow.
We're probably 200, 220, something like that, for some of your basic harvest cost.
So you could potentially have a price that would be low enough that you wouldn't recoup your harvest cost.
Correct, yeah.
That's fascinating.
The harvest costs are just so much larger relative to corn and soybeans. And so that's why we see quite a bit of acreage abandonment, even in potentially years where the yield's not bad. It's just the price has gotten low maybe enough to where it becomes part of this decision around variable cost, just the marginal cost of harvesting that.
Man, that's like undergraduate entry-level microeconomics. We should be using that as an example.
Yeah, cotton's really fascinating. I'm a Midwest guy, and so I've learned a lot about cotton and rice and peanuts, now canola, because those are very southern crops, and I've learned quite a bit about them. Still learning, always learning. I did know about the spraying. So thrips is the bug, right? And there's no control for that. So you spray. All my friends that have cotton, all summer, all I'd get is Snapchats of them on a sprayer. But
then the growth regulators as well.
The growth regulators as well. And since it's a crop that never stops growing, you got to spray it and kill it at the end of the season as well.
That's something interesting I learned that I didn't know until maybe last year, is that cotton's technically a perennial crop, and that's why they shred it at the end of every year after they harvest it.
Yeah, it's basically a tree. I mean, it is a tree. When I was in undergrad, I mentioned I had a plant science double major, and one of the courses we did had cotton seeds that we planted and grew it. So I actually grew my own cotton plant, and I was convinced I was going to try to get it to grow for the next year. Of course, you can do that with one and hand pick it, right? But the way we harvest cotton, it becomes an annual crop. But it is a perennial cotton.
Right, because you have to defoliate it at the end of the season so it doesn't stain. The leaves don't stain the cotton green, but if you go out and defoliate it and then you get a rain on it, then it just comes back and you have to go defoliate it again. So it's really a headache to deal with. So it's a headache, and you're losing a ton of money on it.
Not only that, how many trips across the field to till before you plant it? You have at least three sometimes passes with a tillage system before you plant it.
Because you want it really level, or what?
We do, I don't know what it is in Missouri, but we do a ton of, all of ours is bedded. You come in and you disc it and loosen up all the dirt, and then you come back with a bedder and form everything into the piles, basically your beds, and then you have to come back separately and knock the top off the bed to create a flat planting surface. So it's 3 passes.
The other thing, after tillage, I did some time down in West Texas. I'd say it like I was in prison, but I actually loved my time down there. I interned for a dairy, but they were in cotton country, and I learned from some of the agronomists that cotton, it just wants to die up until it's been out of the ground for a week or two. Then after that, it doesn't want to die whatsoever. And it's windstorms and that sort of thing can kill it. Cold weather, and it'll be done in early stages of growth. But then after that, it just takes off. Fascinating crop to me.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Who would have guessed I would have came to Indiana? We'd spend this much time talking about cotton. But here we are. I love cotton.
There is, we always joke that if you put enough people who are interested in farms in a room, like you get strange diversions.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Like, because we just talked about furrows and topping furrows. That's a pretty niche audience that wants to like have that conversation, you know?
If you want to run equipment, get into cotton.
Avery, what do you want to talk to Ben about?
Well, Ben, thanks for coming to speak at the conference, and thanks for being on the podcast today. Something that struck me from your talk earlier is the correlation between energy prices and agricultural commodity prices. And I thought that was super interesting and something I've been thinking a lot of lately. Reading the Wall Street Journal, I've been reading a lot about Venezuela and what's to come with the oil market there and how the U.S. could interact. How do you see the changes to this Venezuelan government and potentially global oil markets in relation to the U.S.'s ag economy?
Sure. And we could spend a lot of time talking about this. The initial impression was that this would be bearish to the oil market. Venezuela has a lot of oil reserves that they're sitting on. And there was maybe this thought that we'd see rapid growth in oil production. The U.S. is talking about a lot of investment in Venezuela from oil and energy companies. Their oil system that they have in Venezuela is similar to some of what we would see in Canada, the very heavy dark crude. And so you look at the economics between the two and you ask the question, well, if I had the choice between Canada or Venezuela, why would I leave Canada? And so I think when the market did open on that Sunday night and even the following days afterwards, and we saw just a little bit higher oil prices, but pretty flat in the grand scheme of things, I think now you're starting to see people say, well, maybe we don't see as big of oil supplies to the global market as maybe what we initially thought in the hours leading up to it. And again, Venezuela is a country I don't normally think about a whole lot, but here we are, in 2026 talking about Venezuela. So that would be what I'd say about Venezuela. I'd say the thing you mentioned about the connection between energy and agriculture, there's always been kind of this connection between the two. Both of them are commodities, oil, corn, soybeans, commodities. We see them in a lot of portfolios as a hedge against inflation. So from an investment standpoint, we've got that. But just with the growth that we've seen in the biofuel space over the last 15 to 20 years, just continues to increase that connection between energy and then also row crop commodity economics.
Yeah, we've talked about cotton here and how acreage is going down. And in your talk, you said a lot of that's going into corn, becoming corn acres. It seems like the solution to everybody's low return, low profit problem is plant more corn. Is aviation fuel, is the ethanol aviation fuel, is that the silver bullet? Is that going to save everybody? The corn's got to go somewhere, right? Like that's what I keep coming back to in my mind when I hear those numbers.
Sure, yeah. So you are correct on the first part of that. Everything's going to corn, right? And that was the case in 25. Like every crop gave up acreage to corn.
Yeah.
And I think we maybe see a similar standing in 2026. We might not lose acres and all those crops to corn, but corn's just going to maintain what they took this last year, right? It is kind of what I think we're going to see in the year ahead. So from that standpoint, now your question about sustainable aviation fuel or synthetic aviation fuel, whatever you want to call it these days, but we would consider that a rather aspirational goal.
Okay.
It's out there, but the economics don't really support the growth in that sector. For a period of time, we had a lot of airline companies that were voluntarily starting to talk about using sustainable aviation fuel. Some of them have now announced that they're not going to do that. Some countries are asking for mandates to do that. So you might see specific countries that do that. But here in the United States, I'd say it's a pretty aspirational goal yet and would require policy intervention or policy changes to really get it to take off, if I can use that pun.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Okay, so the farmers seem to be long-term decision makers, at least the people who are kind of left doing this, because we know that things change, right? And so that can be great because you don't sort of make these quick and pivoting moves. We know this is an uncertain game, and if you play the same strategy over and over again, that's probably a decent play. But it also makes us fairly susceptible to just kind of keep doing what we've always done as opposed to be thoughtful about our long-term strategy. When I think about the families that I know who are farming, their long-term mentality has been really successful. Is that still a good decision in this environment, or should there be more thought around strategy for the future based upon everybody's going to plant corn? Everybody's, we have these big conversations.
Yeah. So I think this is a great conversation and great question. My answer to the question specifically is yes, I think you still have to think long-term. I think that has to be part of farmer decision-making. And so I don't want to discourage anybody from thinking long-term, even with all these challenges. Here's how I think that's changing in terms of how we think about long-term decision-making. Asset specificity. I can't say that word, but basically if you have an asset and you can only do one thing with it, That has worked in the past, but I don't think that's our future. Okay. So relationships still matter. Strategic partnerships and intentional relationships still matter within this business. And I think those are the long-term decisions and long-term planning farmers should, and that's a value judgment, but in my opinion, should be thinking about building relationships, strategic partnerships is a long-term decision making. Let me use poultry as an example, right? Modern poultry barns are a big investment. You're talking about $1 million+ investment in a poultry barn that may take a little bit of an on-ramp period to get it built. Right now, we're seeing a little bit of delay in terms of when you can build a poultry barn. But let's just say the poultry sector, really struggles and goes through a prolonged period of transition or some type of recession, depression type thing in that specific sector. Currently, and where I see the long-term going, that leads me to be kind of concerned about making some type of investment to where maybe I need 6 to 7 years to recoup my investment in that asset. But if in year 2 or 3, if something goes awry, is there an alternative to use that asset? As I look ahead, I'm going to say, I don't think that's where we need to be focusing. I think we need to be focusing as production agriculture and looking at assets that can be used in multiple different ways. Land continues, row crops continue to be something like that, right? So here in the Midwest, primarily corn and soybeans, but there's other crops we can grow on that same land. Canola is an example of that. I talked about canola today during the talk about how we're seeing an increase. Well, that's been a product of coming into some of that land. We can run cattle on that land, right? We could do solar, things like that. It provides us options, multiple different options. To answer the question about long-term, I think we have to be focused on it. I think it has to be relationship building, but I would be very, very cautious about investing in assets that can only be used in 1 or 2 very niche and special ways.
I didn't know I was going to be the cotton guy, but that comes back to a cotton harvester.
Hey, what do you do with it after if you don't grow cotton?
Your only option is to sell it to your neighbor who hopefully needs one and grows cotton. Those are your only options. You can't just change to corn or soybeans like you can with your conventional harvesters.
So flexibility becomes the name of the game, I think, in the long run, right?
Yeah.
We've seen this in several different commodities. Dairy comes to mind, and we're seeing it in some other type of livestock. If you build a relationship and that relationship is good, that's fine, but you also expose yourself to third-party risk to where if that buyer exits and there's no one else to buy your asset, but you're still sitting there with an $800,000 ownership note on that barn and you got to figure out what to do with it. That's where we're seeing some of the challenges in this space. Same thing with the cotton harvester.
Okay, so another thought that I have is that, I'm nearly 40, and so I did not experience the farm financial crisis, but I think my birth signaled the end of it.
So I'm the same way.
Okay.
I always say I didn't grow up in the 1980s, but I grew up in the long shadow of the 1980s, right? I can point to specific things in my life that now, after I've learned and been a student of this industry, I can point to specific things that my family did that I'm like, okay, that was a direct result of them living through the 1980s, right?
No. Yeah, that's dinner conversation still, right? We're still hashing the 1980s. So the thing that is interesting is we had a pretty significant solvency problem in the 80s. And we don't have that today. It doesn't seem to be, at least yet.
I would agree.
But we definitely have a significant cash flow problem to the point where even people with really, really strong asset base are probably their banks are asking them different questions maybe than they were asked previously. And maybe they didn't get an operating loan. What do you think about the financial sector health and how people are going to manage low cash returns and crop production if we go into yet another year of low cash returns?
Sure. Yeah. So I would agree with you on the financing space. We are not seeing the deterioration in solvency ratios broadly. There's pockets, I think of prime cotton and rice country where that's a dominant market and not a lot of livestock. We are seeing some land sales that are starting to cause a little bit of deterioration in land value. So that's starting to see some of these solvency issues start to pop up. But broadly speaking, I don't think we're seeing the solvency issues, nor do I think we'll see the deterioration in land like what we saw in the 1980s. And people listening are probably like, well, that's what somebody said in 1979. And that's true, right? Like, you never think it's going to happen. But we have quite a few changes in terms of safety nets that exist out there. And the other thing that I would say is the amount of ownership of land that is well positioned and either owned by somebody outside of agriculture or a very established, balanced farmer. I think we'd have to see this shortage of cash flow exist many more years before we really started to see some of the solvency issues that we saw in the 1980s. And so I don't know if that provides any security for anybody or any hope or whatever. I'm just saying, I just don't think we'll see the solvency challenges. So from that standpoint. Now to the lender conversations in terms of accessing financing, right? A lot of people use their asset base to get financing. And I think we've seen that really tighten up because it's now becoming very much a cash flow game. Yes, you have the asset, but the asset does not necessarily justify cash or the ability for debt repayment. And so you're seeing a lot of lenders really focus on that debt repayment capacity, even outside of selling an asset. Does that start to encourage more asset sales as farms struggle to get, traditional financing from either a bank or even third-party financing through an input supplier? If that becomes a little bit harder to get because of this debt repayment capacity issue, and we start to see some land sales and some transactions, that could then cause a little bit of softness in the market. But as of right now, I'm not seeing a whole lot. And I think that's where it comes down to is like, we are seeing banks pull back on lending. I had a farmer call just the other day. And of course, I talk with a lot of farmers. He called me at 8:02 on a Monday morning. And I talk to a lot of farmers all the time. And most of the time I believe them to always tell me the truth. Sometimes I wonder if they tell me all the truth. But this particular farmer had $5 million in assets with 75% paid off equity, and his loan officer declined their operating this year. And they had to go find a different bank and different provider to provide that operating loan. So I do think we're seeing some tightness.
Wow. Do you think for land in particular, this provides opportunities to build some of those strategic relationships with more institutional capital in exchange for taking on debt to buy land now because of the cash flow challenges? Do you think this is providing a great opportunity for institutional capital and big time investors to come in and help farmers with that access to capital they need?
So I'd say we've seen a slowdown in the big institutional investors because the returns in the stock market relative to the returns in land kind of favored alternative investments other than land. Now, I always say that they're smart and they jump into the land market when there's a good buy. So if land values started to look like they were undervalued relative to where they could be, you would start to see alternative investors outside of agriculture come into the space. That's one of the reasons why I think we have somewhat of a floor in land markets. They recognize that an asset can get out undervalued and buy into it. And so to some extent, farmers don't like to hear this, but to some extent we need outside investors because that's what keeps our land market from collapsing. They come in when they feel like it's undervalued. To your point about relationships, yes, I'll hit on that again. I do think that we're in an era to where building those relationships and being good stewards of land for an asset owner just continue to grow in importance and relevance. And I think will continue as we move through the future.
Okay. One of the things, like, as I hear you say the relationship piece and thinking back to 25-year-old Chad and in thinking about how I would take in that podcast, where would you, the three of you are really smart, where would the three of you start on trying to build strategic relationships if you're a row crop farmer? How would you go about that process? I think that there was always this idea that we should find some partner who has, ultimately it was usually the doctor or the dentist or somebody who you can convince to come buy 140 acres when you can't. When I think about the idea, it makes tons of sense. The tasks that I would go through to accomplish that idea seem difficult.
I would start with like personal network, like just people who are smart people. I'll use an example of some people I know at home. A guy and one of his buddies, they I think went to college together and then just kind of went their separate ways. And he went into the vegetable buying industry. He was a representative of grocery stores going to farmers buying vegetables for some different grocery stores. And I think that had kind of run his course and he didn't really feel like he wanted to do that as much anymore. And he moved back home and his friend was looking to diversify and they went in together and bought a vegetable packer that had been run down and put a lot of money into it. The farmer was excellent and he could grow the vegetables, and his buddy was excellent and had lots of connections in the grocery store industry. He could get them sold. And that's been a fantastic deal for them that has really helped them a lot in some of these less than ideal market times.
Yeah, I would agree. That's an excellent story. I would agree with that fully. Yeah, and I think there's opportunities to grow niche products and look outside what we traditionally think. I get the opportunity to teach our upper level farm risk management course at the University of Missouri. I love my students, but the majority of them come with ideas of how to work in production agriculture that are very different than what we have historically thought. Outside of just corn and soybeans, I had one student that was growing grain sorghum to produce the molasses or the sugar to be used in sorghum whiskey. And he had built a strategic partnership with a distributor a distiller in St. Louis, and that market share was growing for them, and they were constantly adding more sorghum acres and working with producers that would allow them to grow sorghum on acres. So there, there's another example. Llamas, right, is another thing, right? That's a livestock category component here. And so, there's these examples and these strategic partnerships in avenues and channels that aren't necessarily just corn and soybeans. Now, if I was somebody that was looking to grow my strategic partnerships in corn and soybeans right now, the way I think I would do that is used equipment or just equipment. And we've seen values come down. So it's relative cheap to where it was. It's still not cheap. People would argue it's not cheap at all, but it's relative cheap to where it was. You can get a pretty attractive financing note to finance some equipment. And I would look at getting into the custom agriculture, whatever, planting, spraying. If you're cotton and you got to get across your field 14 times in the summer or 10 times in the summer,
Spraying.
right? Buy a sprayer at a relatively cheap and run as many acres through that machine as I possibly could, build that network of producers that I'm helping. Maybe they can't get over all their acres because it was really wet and they need some additional help to spray their acres. Well, now all of a sudden I'm providing them value in strategic partnerships to where I'm building that network. And then maybe at the end of that producer's timeline, he's like, hey, you've been a great partner in this endeavor. Would you be interested in taking an ownership in this operation or buying into this operation? My answer to this question is unique now because equipment values have come down. You can get a cheap relative interest note, but custom work right now would be a way to get into the corn and soybean markets. But there's avenues outside of corn and soybeans too.
Yeah.
This is a little bit off of being a starting farmer, but I think that strategic partnerships with livestock producers is really important and is going to continue to be really important. Chad, you have some experience with that. If you're a corn and soybean producer, having manure on your farm is a hedge against input prices, well, fertilizer, but it's a hedge on that. And then additionally, it's a little bit of a hedge on the commodity prices too, because lean hogs or beef cattle or dairy or whatever you have on your farm is usually fairly uncorrelated with corn and soybeans, especially if you're feeding corn and soybeans to your cattle. If prices are cheap, that's good margins for your dairy. If prices are high, then it's good margins for your corn and soybean operations. So I think that having partnerships and strategic relationships with livestock producers and integrators is really important and going to continue to be really important.
Man, that's good. So in my head, what I was thinking is how do you approach the Purdue retirement fund and how to convince them to buy farmland? So you guys, all three of you answered a different perspective on that strategic partner, which I think is awesome. That's really, because I think that was always the part as a producer. It always, who am I to go and talk to, this big management fund? And I got laughed out of rooms in multiple places, But you said very practical sort of things within the network, people who are in the industry and will look at you favorably as opposed to being like, what are you doing here pitching us to buy 160 acres? So I love that. Any other questions you guys have for Ben?
Yeah, I want to pick your brain, Ben, on
Go ahead.
on different parts of the Corn Belt and different parts of ag in the country. You've done some time in Kansas and Ohio and Missouri, and here you are in Indiana. I want to hear cultural differences, but also some economic differences as we're sitting around talking about these things today.
Yeah. So, you do see these cultural pockets. The Delta region, for instance, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana is very different than where we sit up here. For a very long time, Indiana had always had this mix of poultry and egg production plus row crop, and that was very unique kind of to this space. Iowa also had kind of some of that same type of blend of mix. Now we're seeing it in places like Missouri, Oklahoma, Northwest Arkansas, a lot of growth in poultry and egg production. They had to do that. Companies had to do that to provide a safety net or a risk management standpoint around some of the avian flu and diseases. They don't want their whole enterprise to be wiped out if disease breaks out. So a little bit of geographical diversity there too. To the specific question about demographics, there are some differences in terms of how people think about stuff. I would say most of it's related to rainfall. That's where I see the biggest difference. The folks out in Kansas that are only getting 12 inches of rain a year have a very different mindset in terms of how they plant crops and how they invest in the crop throughout the growing season than you would here in Indiana, where I'm guessing the average rainfall somewhere around like 36, 38 inches a year or something like that. The rainfall has a tendency to be a signal of culture. Also, just like the growth that we've seen in alternative investments outside of ag. Here in the Eastern Corn Belt, you guys have had a lot of growth in urban sprawl, solar initially, and now we're getting solar out west as well. Some of the things are different across the Corn Belt at specific times, but I think we all experience them eventually. You guys might be a precursor to us by 5 to 10 years. And then all of a sudden, those same types of things and mentality and questions start to pop up in Missouri. And then, of course, the rainfall and the weather patterns that we've seen. I always joke about this, and it's really not a joke. It's actually very sad. But our corn crop in Missouri is always made if a hurricane hits Texas in August. That's when we get the rain that makes our corn crop. So we start getting excited when there's activity happening in the Gulf.
Sure.
Because that means we're going to get rain in Missouri, and it's going to make our August corn crop. So, weather has a pattern in that as well. The difference across regions is the whole reason we at the University of Missouri, in partnership with USDA, have started looking at state-level farm incomes, because the national farm incomes were fine, but they hid a lot of the very nuanced details at the state levels. And so we're now in like year 3 of this, and we can look at how a state like Nebraska that has a lot of cattle feeding compares to a state like Indiana, where there's a lot more hogs and a lot more chickens. How does that farm income categories kind of shift over time? And it helps us at least be a little bit better at targeting some assistance if it needs to roll out. So I don't know if I answered your question about differences culturally and geographically, other than to say that there's probably more similarities across the Corn Belt than people realize.
Mm-hmm.
It just comes sometimes at different times.
I think we should close this up. So thank you, Ben, Jonah, Avery.
Thanks, guys.